What do you do when you're thousands of feet in the air? Your aircraft is crippled, and the very mechanism designed to bring you home safely is gone? When a massive, multi-engine bomber returns from a punishing raid over enemy territory, its landing gear shot away, the crew is faced with an impossible equation. They must find a way to set nearly 30 tons of straining metal and volatile fuel onto the Earth without tearing their plane apart. This is not a hypothetical scenario from a flight manual. This is a dire reality faced by countless airmen during the Second World War. This is the story of an emergency maneuver born of sheer desperation that evolved into a practiced, life-saving art, the belly landing. Across every theater of the air war, from the frozen skies over Germany to the sweltering Pacific Islands, pilots and crews were forced to make a choice: bail out over hostile territory or attempt the unthinkable. This is the story of courage, innovation, and raw skill, where the runway became a grinding sheet of metal and survival was measured in inches and seconds. The story begins not with a single plane, but with the relentless, brutal calculus of strategic bombing, where every mission risked catastrophic damage and every return flight was a battle in itself. By 1943, the air war over Europe had reached a brutal, industrial scale. American B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 Liberators of the 8th and 15th Air Forces penetrated deep into Fortress Europe by day, while the British RAF's Lancasters and Halifaxes pounded German cities by night. The objective was strategic paralysis: destroy factories, disrupt oil production, and break the enemy's will. But the cost was astronomical. Luftwaffe fighters, Focke-Wulf FW-190s and Messerschmitt Bf-109s swarmed the bomber streams, unleashing torrents of 20mm cannon fire. The skies were thick with flak, anti-aircraft artillery bursts that filled the air with black, smoking shrapnel clouds capable of shredding an aircraft in seconds. It was within this lethal environment that the belly landing, or wheels-up landing, transitioned from a rare, catastrophic accident to a studied, if dreaded, procedure. The anatomy of a heavy bomber made a conventional landing without wheels a near suicidal prospect. Aircraft like the B-17 were designed with a narrow, rounded fuselage belly and vulnerable underside components: fuel lines, hydraulic systems, bomb bay doors, and the belly turret. Landing directly on this surface promised a cascade of disasters: sparks igniting fuel vapors, the fuselage buckling and snapping, or the aircraft ground looping violently as it dug into the earth. Initial protocols were grim. If the landing gear was irrevocably damaged, crews were often advised to bail out over friendly territory if possible, letting the aircraft crash. But as the war progressed and bomber crews became more experienced, a stubborn will to save both men and machine took hold. Pilots began to experiment, guided by desperate instinct and post-mission debriefs. They were aided by the inherent design of these bombers. Their wing-mounted engines and propellers sat high enough that, with precise control, they might avoid immediate destruction. The key lay in an almost unnatural level of piloting finesse: a slow, perfectly controlled descent, holding the nose high until the last possible second, and setting the aircraft down on the strongest part of the fuselage with minimal sideways drift. It was a maneuver that demanded ice-cool nerves from the pilot and absolute trust from every man strapped in behind him. The margin for error was zero. This was the terrifying knowledge that rested on the shoulders of men like those aboard a specific B-17F, nicknamed the Hard Luck, returning to its base at RAF Molesworth in the autumn of 1943. The mission for the Hard Luck and the rest of the 303rd Bombardment Group on October 14, 1943, was a familiar nightmare. The industrial city of Schweinfurt, deep in southern Germany, home to vital ball-bearing factories. This was the second raid on the city, later known as Black Thursday, and the Luftwaffe was waiting. The bomber stream faced relentless attacks from the moment it crossed the Dutch coast. With a crew of the Hard Luck, piloted by a 24-year-old first lieutenant from Ohio named James R. Jimmy Stewart, no relation to the actor, the flak over the target was particularly intense. As they steadied for the bomb run, the plane was jolted by a series of concussions. A near miss from an 88mm shell sent shrapnel tearing through the aircraft's underside. The bombardier, in his plexiglass nose, felt the shockwave. The radio operator heard a sickening clang and the sharp hiss of ruptured hydraulic lines. In the cockpit, warning lights flickered. The flight engineer, his eyes scanning the instrument panel, saw the hydraulic pressure dropping rapidly. He reported to Stewart in a tense, clipped voice, "Captain, "We're losing fluid. A lot of it." The bomb run was completed, the bays emptied, and the hard luck turned for the long, harrowing flight home, now lagging behind the protection of the main formation. The damage assessment began. The hydraulic fluid was indeed bleeding out, a fine, pungent mist visible in the slipstream behind them. This system powered not only the landing gear, but also the bomb bay doors, flaps, and wheel brakes. The engineer and the co-pilot attempted to manually crank the landing gear down using the emergency hand pump. They strained against the levers, sweat pouring down their faces in the freezing cabin air. For a moment, there was hope as the left main gear grudgingly extended and locked with a solid thunk. But the right gear only descended halfway before jamming, bent and mangled by shrapnel. The nose will refuse to budge at all. They were facing a partial failure, one of the most dangerous configurations imaginable. One locked wheel could cause the plane to cartwheel violently the moment it touched concrete. For 3 agonizing hours, the crew of the Hard Luck nursed their wounded bird across the North Sea. They threw out every piece of loose equipment, ammunition, flak jackets, even the Norden bombsight sensitive components to lighten the aircraft. They calculated their remaining fuel to the gallon, knowing they had one chance at one airfield. Radio contact was made with their home base at Molesworth. The control tower was alerted. Emergency vehicles, fire trucks, ambulances, crash crews raced to line the runway, their sirens a silent scream on the ground. Back in the air, Jimmy Stewart gathered his crew over the intercom. His voice was calm, a forced steadiness that belied the knot in his stomach. He laid out the options, though they all knew there was only one real choice. Bailing out over the English countryside in daylight was possible, but it would mean the certain destruction of the aircraft, a loss the war effort could ill afford. "We're going to bring her in," Stewart said. "We're going to do it on the belly. Listen to my commands and brace like you've never braced before." The atmosphere inside the fuselage transformed. The casual, weary banter of the return flight vanished, replaced by a sacred, focused silence. Each man retreated into his own mental preparations. The gunners secured their turrets, clambering into the main fuselage to find secure brace points along the spar. They stuffed rags into their helmets to cushion their heads. The radio operator transmitted their final intentions. The engineer made one last, futile attempt on the hand pump. It was no use. The crippled right gear hung like a dead limb. As the green fields of England materialized beneath the broken clouds, Stewart began his final approach. He ordered the co-pilot to lower the flaps manually, a back-breaking process that took precious minutes. The airspeed bled off. The engines, set to low RPM, droned a steady, mournful note. The runway at Molesworth stretched out before them, a gray ribbon looking impossibly narrow, lined with the tiny red specks of fire trucks. Stewart's world narrowed to the cockpit window, the airspeed indicator, and the feel of the control yoke in his hands. He had to achieve the perfect attitude. Nose high, tail low, flying the main fuselage itself onto the ground. One error in angle, and the propellers would dig in, turning the aircraft into a whirlwind of shattered metal. A slight drift to the left or right, and the folded right gear could catch, spinning them into a fatal ground loop. Every instinct screamed to lower the nose, to see the runway. He had to fight those instincts. "Prepare for impact," he said, his voice barely above a whisper on the intercom. "Brace. Race. Race." The shriek of the wind over the airframe dropped to a low moan as the B-17 stalled out just feet above the runway threshold. For a heart-stopping second, the massive bomber seemed to hang in the air, suspended by willpower alone. Then, the first, terrible contact. With a deafening, grinding roar of tearing metal, the strengthened keel of the bomber's fuselage met the concrete. A torrent of brilliant orange sparks erupted in a fountain from the left side of the aircraft, showering the runway for yards as the damaged right landing gear strut scraped and screeched. Inside, the noise was apocalyptic, a cacophony of rending aluminum, shattering plexiglass, and the protest of every rivet and stringer in the airframe. The crew was thrown violently against their harnesses, the force of deceleration pressing them forward as if a giant hand were smashing into the cockpit. Loose equipment, flashlights, thermos bottles, maps became deadly projectiles zipping through the cabin. Stewart fought the controls with all his strength. The yoke shuddered in his hands, threatening to break his wrists. The aircraft wanted to veer left, pulled by the friction of the one locked wheel. He applied right rudder and differential engine power, his muscles screaming, correcting the drift by sheer physical force. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw the left side propeller of the No. 2 engine disintegrate as it kissed the runway, throwing shards of twisted, metal into the wing. The world outside the cockpit was a blur of sparks and smoke. The bomber was now a 25-ton plow, carving a furrow of destruction down the runway. The belly turret, the ball of plexiglass and guns underneath, was sheared off instantly, leaving a gaping hole that howled with the wind of their passage. Fuel lines, miraculously, held, but the smell of gasoline vapor and scorched metal filled the cabin, a promise of potential immolation. In the radio room, the operator had curled into a fetal position against the main spar, his arms wrapped around his head. He could feel the floor grating peeling away beneath him. In the waist section, two gunners, braced against the bulkhead, watched in horror as a long, jagged crack appeared in the fuselage skin, daylight screaming through the tear. The aircraft began to slow, but it was still traveling at over 80 miles per hour, a runaway train with no brakes. The end of the runway, and beyond it, a drainage ditch and a perimeter fence rushed toward them. They were running out of concrete. Stewart knew that if they left the paved surface and hit the soft earth, the nose would dig in and the aircraft would somersault. He had one last card to play. As the speed bled off to around 60, he gently, ever so gently, allowed the nose to settle. The nose section, lacking its wheel, met the runway with a second, jarring impact. The plexiglass bombardier's nose shattered inward in a cloud of glittering fragments. The forward momentum was finally, brutally arrested. The B-17 slid to a shuddering, groaning halt just 50 feet from the end of the tarmac, tilted slightly to the left on its ruined right gear, a cloud of dust, smoke, and steam billowing around it. The deafening roar was replaced by an eerie, ringing silence, punctuated by the ping of cooling metal and the hiss of escaping fluids. For 5 full seconds, no one moved, no one spoke. They were alive. The aircraft was in one piece. But the crisis was far from over. The silence was shattered by the scream of sirens and the shouts of the crashed crew. Fire trucks surrounded the smoldering bomber, men in asbestos suits hosing down the wings and fuselage with chemical foam to prevent any spark from igniting the remaining fuel. Inside, the hard luck. The crew stirred from their shock. Everyone sound off, Stewart barked, his voice raw. One by one, shaky voices called out over the intercom. Pilot, okay. Co-pilot, okay. Navigator, okay. Miraculously, the list completed with no reports of serious injury. They were bruised, battered, bleeding from cuts from flying plexiglass, and profoundly deafened, but they were all alive and mobile. The immediate danger, however, had not passed. The smell of high-octane aviation fuel was overpowering. A fractured line could let loose a flood at any moment. The crash commander, a grizzled veteran sergeant, scrambled onto the left wing, careful to avoid the mangled propeller, and hammered on the cockpit side window. Stewart, his hands trembling with adrenaline, unlocked and heaved it open. Get your men out. Now, fast and orderly. This whole thing could go up. The order was given. The crew's training took over. The exit procedure for a belly-landed aircraft was different. The main hatches could be jammed or compromised. The co-pilot opened the overhead cockpit hatch. The navigator and bombardier climbed out through the shattered nose, cutting their hands on the broken edges. In the back, the crew used the waist gun windows and the top hatch behind the radio room. They moved with speed but not panic, helping each other over the jagged metal. The last man out was the flight engineer, who did a final, visual check for any unconscious crewmates before dropping to the wing and then to the safety of the foam-covered ground. They gathered a safe distance away, a bedraggled group of 10 young men, watching as the fire crews continued to douse their aircraft. They coughed on the acrid smoke, their ears still ringing, their knees weak. They had done it. Against textbook odds, they had brought a mortally wounded aircraft home and walked away from it. But the story of the hard luck was more than a single miraculous survival. It became a data point, a critical case study. Within hours, intelligence officers and engineering teams were swarming the wreck. They photographed every scar, measured every deformation. They interviewed Stewart and his crew with intense focus. What was the exact approach speed? At what angle did you hold the nose? How did the fuselage structure hold up? The shredded belly turret was a lesson. It was a weakness. The intact fuel cells in the wings were a revelation. They were stronger than anticipated. This post-crash analysis was happening at airfields all across England and later in the Pacific. Each successful belly landing and each tragic failure contributed to a growing body of tacit knowledge. Pilots shared stories in officers' clubs. Engineers drafted revised emergency manuals. The procedure evolved from a desperate gamble into a calculated risk. Key lessons were standardized. Jettison all excess weight. Secure loose equipment. Land on grass or a soft field if possible to reduce sparks. Come in with flaps fully extended for the slowest possible speed. Hold the nose off until the last conceivable moment. Most importantly, culture shifted. The command, "prepare for a wheels-up landing," no longer meant an automatic order to bail. It became a call to action, a challenge to the crew's skill and the pilot's nerve. The belly landing was transformed from a death sentence into a grim but viable option. This hard-won knowledge would save hundreds of airmen and salvage millions of dollars worth of aircraft. It was a testament to the adaptability and courage of the men who flew, turning a moment of catastrophic failure into a disciplined drill for survival. The legacy of Jimmy Stewart and the crew of the Hard Luck was not just their own lives saved, but the invisible textbook they helped write for every bomber crew that followed. The B-17F, the Hard Luck, never flew again. It was classified as Category E damage, a complete write-off, but its skeleton was cannibalized for parts, and its story was immortalized in after-action reports and shared among the bomber groups. Lieutenant James R. Stewart and his crew were given a 48-hour pass and a steady supply of whiskey at the Officers' Club. They completed their tour of 25 missions, their confidence forever altered by the events of October 14th. Stewart was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for his extraordinary achievement and heroism in bringing his crew and aircraft home under extreme duress. The belly landing became a hauntingly common sight in the final years of the war. As the Allied air offensive reached a crescendo in 1944 and 1945, crippled bombers limping back to base became part of the daily landscape. At fields like RAF Bassingbourn or the sprawling complex on Tinian in the Pacific, it was not unusual to see a B-29 or a Lancaster skidding to a fiery, grinding halt, its crew emerging shaken but alive. Each successful landing added to the lore and the procedural knowledge. The statistics are stark. Of the thousands of heavy bombers lost during WWII, several hundred were documented as attempting wheels-up landings. While many ended in fatal crashes or explosions, a significant percentage, likely in the hundreds, were successful, saving the lives of thousands of airmen who would have otherwise been lost to bailouts over hostile terrain or the sea. The true legacy of these events is found in the cold, precise language of post-war aviation manuals and the continued use of the technique. The belly landing, born in the fire of WWII, became a standard emergency procedure for all multi-engine aircraft. It is a direct link between the desperate choices of a 24-year-old pilot over England and the safety protocols that govern global aviation today. It stands as a powerful symbol of the airman's creed, to bring his crew home by any means necessary, fighting for control until the last rivet stops vibrating. The scarred runways of old Allied air bases, some still bearing the long, dark smears of metal from these events, are silent testaments to a generation of young men who stare down impossible odds and, through skill, courage, and sheer force of will, found a way to land. This was just one of countless untold stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to War Legend Recorded as we continue to bring these forgotten chapters of history back to life.